This is part 10 of the 2013 ELA Assessment Scoring Series. In this, we're going to look at the Grade 8 Extended Response. We'll look at both the guide set and the practice sets. You're going to need to have a copy of the Grade 6 to 8 rubric, a copy of the Grade 8 guide set, and a copy of the Grade 8 practice set. If you don't have copies of those, you can download them from e2ela.wikispaces.com/scoring. When you open up the guide set, you're going to find two passages. The first is The Story of My Life by Helen Keller. The second is Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, an American Slave by Frederick Douglass. Please take a few minutes to read both of those passages and pause the video and come back when you're done. The students were asked to respond to this question. The story of my life and narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass, an American slave, share many ideas about the human condition and character. What is the major central idea that is shared by both passages? Explain the importance of the shared central idea for each narrator. Discuss similarities and differences in the role of shared central idea for each narrator. Use details from both passages to support your response. In your response, be sure to identify a central idea shared by both passages, the story of my life and narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass, an American slave. Explain the importance of the central idea to each narrator. Explain the similarities and differences in the importance of the central idea for each narrator, and use details from both passages to support your response. Guide paper 1 goes like this. The story of my life and narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass, an American slave, share many ideas about human condition or character. There is a main idea that both passages share. Both passages have similarities and differences. In both passages, there is a main central idea that both share. The story of my life and narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass, an American slave's main idea was that anyone can learn to read, write, or learn words in the hardest times of their lives. For Helen Keller, the hardest time of her life was being both blind and deaf. That made it more difficult for her to learn how to read and write, especially if you can't hear how they say the words or see what the words may look like in life. It was also hard for Frederick Douglass to learn. He was a slave, and you could get whipped or get something cut off if you were caught learning how to read and write. Douglass was abused a lot by his mistress. He had to sneak around to learn, and if he got caught, he was abused even more. There are some similarities and differences to the main idea that both stories share. The difference is that one narrator is blind and deaf, and the other narrator is a slave who isn't supposed to be learning anything. One is being encouraged to learn, while the other is being beaten up if caught learning. They are similar because they both faced hard times, but still managed to get over it. Helen and Frederick got to learn even though it was a task that was very hard to accomplish. The passages, the story of my life and the one about Frederick Douglass's life, had a central main idea that they shared. Both narrators faced hard times and wanted to learn. They had many similarities and differences about each other. Guide paper 1 was scored as a 4. Take a minute to look at the rubric and follow along as we go through the different points. The response clearly introduces a topic in a manner that follows logically from the task and purpose. That is an element of a Level 4 content and analysis, as is the response demonstrates insightful analysis into the texts. The topic is developed with sustained use of relevant, well-chosen evidence from the text that's varied. Clear organization is exhibited by the skillful use of appropriate and varied transitions. The response maintains a formal style using grade-appropriate and domain-specific vocabulary. The concluding statement follows clearly from the topic and information presented. Those are all elements of a Level 4 paper. Finally, the response demonstrates great appropriate command of conventions with few errors. In this case, the student scored a 4 on almost every element, although that's not necessary for a final score of 4. In this case, that's what the student got. Guide paper 2 is a different way of getting to a 4. The student writes, in the story of my life and narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass, an American slave, share one common idea. The common idea the stories share is that education is important. In the story of my life, Helen Keller learns words from her teacher by the words being traced in her arms and hands. In the book Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, an American Slave, Douglass learns to read at first by his mistress, then by the hungry children that lived on Philpott Street. The similarities of their learning were it was hard for them to learn, and it took a long time to learn new things. The differences were Helen Keller was blind, Frederick Douglass was not. Douglass always wanted to read. Helen Keller had a brief time where she didn't, and Frederick Douglass was taught by many different people while Helen Keller was taught by one teacher. The reason education was important to Helen Keller is it gave her a whole different perspective. It was important to Frederick Douglass because he wanted to read books and newspapers. Education is important to everyone. Frederick Douglass and Helen Keller are two great examples of this. This paper was scored as a 4. The response clearly introduces a topic in a manner that follows logically from the task and purpose, and it uses sustained use of relevant, well-chosen evidence from text that's varied. Those are both 4s. Clear organization is exhibited by the skillful use of appropriate transitions. The response maintains a formal style. There's a concluding statement that follows clearly from the topic and the information presented, and the response demonstrates great appropriate command of conventions with few errors. In each case, every one of those elements is at a level 4. Guide paper 3 is a 3. The student writes, in the story of my life, Helen Keller, a blind and deaf little girl, is being taught certain words and does not yet understand them. The first word that she is taught is doll. She does not really know what it means and is just moving her hands in a monkey-like fashion. Then one day she understands it all, that everything has a name and every name is spelled a certain way using letters. In the story Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, an American Slave, he is a slave living with the Hughes family, going on 7 years now. The person that he likes the most is the tender-hearted mistress. She was very kind and gave food to the hungry and clothes to the naked. But one day she started something she could not go back on. She started to teach the slave how to read and write, but first started with the alphabet. These two stories are similar because they are involved to very different people faced with similar problem. Helen Keller, a small girl that is blind and deaf. Frederick Douglass, a grown African-American man. They both face a problem they cannot read or write, so they get taught. They both also care for something, like Helen Keller, who loved her doll, and Frederick Douglass, who loved his mistress. Guide paper 3 was scored as a 3. The response clearly introduces a topic in a manner that follows from the task and purpose and demonstrates great appropriate analysis of the texts. It's developed with relevant details from the texts, and the use of relevant evidence is sustained with some lack of variety. The response exhibits clear organization with the use of appropriate transitions, and there's a formal style established using precise language and domain-specific vocabulary. The response demonstrates great appropriate command of conventions with occasional errors. They don't hinder the comprehension. Guide paper 4 is the second 3. In the passages, Helen Keller, a Frederick Douglass, both overcome obstacles. Helen, being both blind and deaf, has to learn words and meanings of them. Frederick is a slave that wants to learn but wants to read. So the main point of these stories is that you can do anything if you try. The importance of the central point is that you shouldn't give up. Helen Keller had to have the feel of the words. They had to be written on her hand. She didn't like it, but she wanted to learn them. Frederick wanted to read, but he was a slave and he couldn't. So he would run errands, then go find someone to teach him how to read. Even though the main idea of the passages is the same, the way they use it is different. Frederick is easily capable of learning, and he just wants to be able to read. Helen wants to be able to identify an object without vision or hearing it. Yet there are similarities. They both want to learn something new. The student's paper was scored as a 3. It clearly introduces a topic in a manner that follows from the task and purpose and demonstrates grade appropriate analysis of the texts. The topic is developed with relevant details from the texts, and that use of that evidence is sustained with some lack of variety. The response exhibits clear organization and the appropriate use of transitions, and a formal style is established and maintained using domain-specific vocabulary. The concluding statement follows from the topic and the information presented. The response demonstrates grade-appropriate command of conventions with occasional errors that do not hinder comprehension. So again, if you take a look at the level 3, go straight down the column, the student pretty much nailed every one of those elements. Guide paper 5 is the first 2. The central idea of both The Story of My Life and Frederick Douglass, an American Slave, is that learning is key. Learning is important because it feeds our curiosity and gives us knowledge of what's going on around the world. In the story about Helen Keller, she learns how to read by touching the object. And in Frederick Douglass's story, he knows how to read a book even though he is a slave. But I think it is easier for Frederick to learn because he can see. Helen Keller can't see or hear, which makes it extremely hard, almost impossible. Again, learning is key to our society. The student was scored a 2 on this paper. The response introduces a topic in a manner that follows generally from the task and purpose, and it demonstrates a literal comprehension of the texts. The topic is partially developed with the use of some textual evidence, and it exhibits some organization, at least an attempt. There is inconsistent use of the transitions, and the concluding statement follows generally from the information that's presented. There's an emerging command of conventions with some errors, and they do hinder comprehension just a bit. Guide paper 6 is another 2. The student writes, in both passages, Helen and Frederick both are learning new words and are trying their best at learning. It is important for them to learn new words so they can understand things better other than not know anything. Even though Helen is blind and deaf, she can understand many things and that all things have names. But Frederick is a slave who wants to learn how to read so that he is like all the white people who know how to read and write. The student was scored a 2 for this response. The response introduces a topic in a manner that follows generally from the task and purpose and demonstrates a literal comprehension of the texts. It's partially developed with the use of some textual evidence, and the response exhibits some attempted organization with the inconsistent use of transitions. A formal style was not maintained. There was inconsistent use of a domain-specific vocabulary. The student did demonstrate grade-appropriate command of the conventions.